Hello everyone, welcome to FrogTalks, the inaugural FrogTalks, the beta. We're excited. We have a huge audience, great speakers. We wanted to bring together some movement makers, some movement doers, some thinkers, people who have great ideas in order to inspire all of us to think about movements or starting our own movement. And I want to actually ask all of you if you'll stay. I know many might need to leave. Stay to the end because we are going to launch a beer movement. And you're not going to want to miss that. It's going to be pretty awesome. So, movements. You know, we're living in the age of movements. Of course, you look around this country and around the world, we are living at a time where there are movements everywhere, all over the place. And movements are like a force. They can be a force for good, or they can be a force for evil. It's a bit like Star Wars. How you use the force depends on you. And that's important because the truth is every single one of you in this room, every single individual, every company, every brand, every entrepreneur can create a movement, can identify, crystallize, align with, and spark a mass movement that reaches deep inside people and turns them on. It's like you reach inside, you flip a switch, and you're activated. And tears just appear. And boom, everything changes. And for good or for bad, nothing is ever the same. And the reason that's important is because we're living in a world with huge challenges. And sometimes we need to stop and realize that we need to say to you, here's an idea you need to hear. Or more importantly, here is something that you need to do. Or here is something that you need to do differently. Movements are based on ideas, or emanated from ideas, but they're grounded in action. That's what we're asking people to do. And all of you are movement makers. You can be movement makers because you are dreamers of dreams. And that's where it starts. And today, this whole event is intended to inspire you. And we have some extraordinary speakers who are going to give us some really great insights. Now, this lovely creature on my right is here to remind us of our attention span. We look at the goldfish who has an attention span of 8 seconds. Human beings, we have an attention span of less than that. So the reason why we have him here is to remind us why we started FrogTalks. We want to have the shortest talks on the planet. Big movement ideas, super short and sharp talks. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the evening. It's someone I've known for many years. He's been a part of the Olympic movement for many decades. Atlanta, Salt Lake City, Beijing, Vancouver, and then a month ago in Lausanne with Eric Garcetti and a bunch of other guys, he brought home the Olympic Games together with the rest for Los Angeles 2028, which is pretty darn cool. We want to understand what is the Olympic movement, because it's been around a long time, and who in the devil was the guy that started all that. And if you want a deeper introduction into that gentleman, you have to read George's book called The Idealist, which we will be able to sign at the end. But please give a warm welcome to my good friend, George HIRTHLER. Welcome to FrogTalks.
Thank you, Scott. That was beautiful. Beautiful introduction. In 21 days, in Lima, Peru, the International Olympic Committee will formally award the 2024 and 2028 Olympic Games to two of the world's greatest cities, Paris and Los Angeles. It's an unprecedented double award. And the fact of the matter is, the Games are coming back to the United States. The United States in 11 years. It's going to happen in 21 days. I'll get back to that. I want to talk to you, though, about the Olympic movement itself, because it's a story I don't think you've heard. It's about the values this movement embodies, and it's all about It is all about what this movement really means to our world. The fact of the matter is, you can make a good argument that the Olympic movement is the most successful movement of the 20th century. It survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, terrorism, political boycotts, you'll remember those, doping, huge doping, and multiple scandals of all sorts, corruption of various kinds. And yet it outpaced the United Nations historically in the growth of its member states, which today numbers 206. 3.5 billion people, that's half the world's population, tune in to watch every edition of the Olympic Games. They tune in to watch the new heroes emerge from all around the world and establish new standards of human performance, generation after generation. But there's one story of heroes that they never hear, and that's the story of the founder of the Olympic movement, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. If you Googled the 10 most influential people out of the 19th century, you'd get a list something like this. All famous, wonderful people, some of whom left great legacies, some left destructive legacies. And yet the founder of the most successful movement of the 20th century never shows up because the International Olympic Committee never tells its origin story, never tells you the story of Baron Pierre de Coubertin. So he remains an unknown genius to us today. He's the founder of the most successful movement of the 20th century, but also a man who created a movement that literally unites our world in friendship and peace through sport as nothing else has. And for that reason alone, we should know who he is. And I'm going to tell you his story today. He was born in Paris on January 1, 1863, which happens to be the same day that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now that's purely a coincidence, but the fact is Coubertin spent his entire life and his family fortune liberating people through sport. He was born into the aristocracy, and yet as a young man, he turned his back on the monarchy and embraced the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity in the Third Republic. Coubertin became a man of the people. When Coubertin was 8, living in Paris, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and the Germans made swift work of the French army and pretty soon put a siege around Paris, starving out the 200,000 residents who were inside the walled city, forcing them to eat all the animals of the city, all their horses, their beloved horses, and even the elephants in the zoo. The violence left a deep scar in the psyche of this young boy. But when he was 11, a new source of hope arrived as the Germans began an excavation that lasted 6 years of ancient Olympia. Olympia had been lost to humanity for 15 centuries, and it was buried in 15 feet of silt. But out of the ground suddenly came 130 statues, 40 monuments, 6,000 coins, 13,000 small bronze icons, and Hermes of Praxiteles, one of the greatest sculptures in history, described by Pausanias as in the Temple of Hera in the 2nd century BC, which is right where the Germans found it. Europe went into a frenzy for the classical world. The imagination of our young protagonist, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, however, was struck by a different notion. He saw that in the ancient world, sport had the power to produce peace in a time of war between warring states. And he was gripped by the idea that this great foundation society of Western civilization, ancient Greek civilization, which gave us, of course, philosophy, astronomy, geometry, zoology, we could keep going on, democracy, it gave us all of those things. Coubertin understood that to that ancient civilization, nothing was more important than the Olympic Games. For 1,200 years, the truce of the gods produced peace across the celebration of the Games. At the age of 20, Coubertin was a major player in the French educational reform movement. He traveled to dozens of prep schools and universities in Britain and 29 colleges and universities in New York. He was right here in the United States. As a result, he was convinced that what French children needed more than anything else was something that the Brits and the Americans already had, gym class. And so he began to work with 100 schools in France to build physical education into their curriculum. And as he did, he began to see the possibilities of international sport and the promotion of international sport. In 1889, at the Paris Universal Exposition, where the Eiffel Tower was introduced to the world, Coubertin saw also the powerful promotional potential of global events. And these things started to work in his imagination. At that expo, he organized an international congress on physical education and aligned it very closely with the first Universal Congress on World Peace. If you check your history, that's the birth of the modern peace movement. The IOC was formed on June 23, 1894, when Coubertin proposed the restoration of the Games before 2,000 people in the from 13 countries in the Sorbonne in Paris, France. Athens was elected to host the 1896 Games, Paris took the 1900 Games, and a movement of sport and peace was born under the patronage of the peace movement at the time. In fact, in the room that night, 6 of the first 13 Nobel Peace Prize winners were present with Coubertin supporting his vision. That tells you how this movement was born out of the peace movement and how related they were. Yet you never hear any of this. You don't hear any of this when you watch the Games. You think of it as only as a sporting event. Coubertin said this at the time: "We shall not have peace until the prejudices which now separate our different nations shall have been outlived. To attain this end, what better means than to bring the youth of all countries periodically together for amicable trials of muscular strength and agility." If you think about it today, the conflict and the prejudices that have emerged again, this message is more relevant than ever, making the Olympic movement a movement that is essential to the future of humanity. Since he was the chief ideologue of the Olympic movement and its lead writer, wrote 60,000 pages in his life, he started to shape a philosophy of life called Olympism. Now, Olympism moves from the personal to the universal. It links human excellence to world peace through a ladder of values that everyone can live out in their own lives. And he was a genius in doing that. But by the end of his life, he guided the first 7 organizational efforts, guided the organization of the first 7 Olympic Games. By the end of his life, he was living as a broken man, living on the hospitality of the city of Lausanne in Switzerland, where the IOC is still headquartered this day, and depressed because he believed his great movement for peace had failed in its larger purpose, because the Nazis had taken over the organization of his 1936 Games, and they were beating the drums of hatred and racism and war behind the spectacular pageantry that he had created. And yet, on the field of play in Berlin, Coubertin's philosophy of friendship and peace through sport took hold in a miraculous way. Jesse Owens, the grandson of an Alabama slave who was destined personally to disprove Hitler's theory of Aryan supremacy, formed a bond of friendship with Luz Long, who was the greatest long jumper at the time in Germany. You've probably heard the story. Jesse Owens comes out in his first competition, wins the gold in the 100 meters. Next day, he puts his sweats on. He runs out on the track to warm up for the long jump, goes down the long jump run and runs through the pit, the sand pit, and the judges yell, "Foul!" And he says, "I wasn't jumping." They said, "Nope, you were jumping. That's a foul." Strips off his sweats, runs down, and does foul. One more foul, and the greatest long jumper in the world is out of the competition. At that point, Luz Long comes up to him, puts his arm around him, and says, "Jesse, you're nervous. Settle down. Do what my teammates and I do. Put a white towel down a foot behind the takeoff mark and jump from there. You'll easily qualify." Jesse Owens did exactly as Luz Long recommended, jumped, won the gold medal. Luz Long, who was under direct orders from Hitler to win at all costs, took the silver. At the end of his life, Jesse Owens wrote in his biography, this is 30 years later, and he stayed in touch with Luz Long's family all the way through that period of time. Luz Long was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Awards are become tarnished and diplomas fade. Championships are mythical things. They have no permanence. What is a gold medal? A trinket? A bauble? What counts, my friends, are the realities of life, the fact of competition, and yes, the great and good friends you make. That is really a remarkable statement from a tremendous hero. Coubertin's legacy lives on in thousands of untold stories like that one. As Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the president of the IOC, said, "We pursue one ideal, that of bringing people together in peace, irrespective of race, religion, and political convictions for the benefit of mankind." Coubertin couldn't have said it any better. What's so amazing about this, that's a description of the Olympic movement. It does not use the word sport. Now, getting back to Paris 2024 and London 2028, I'm hoping that both of those organizing committees, which are going to produce new models of an organizational effort for the IOC to solve some of the problems that it's facing right now. Host city costs have spiraled out of control. In LA will bring them back under control, and we're hoping that Paris will too. But what I'd like to see out of both of those cities is better storytelling. What I'd like to see out of both of those cities is a revitalization of this movement. I would like to see them take this origin story of Baron Pierre de Coubertin and put it right at the front of everything they're doing and everything they say. So the world can begin to realize that the Olympic Games are about far more than sport. And at the same time, they can realize that there's a movement behind those games that is in fact holds more hope and promise for a world than just about anything else. So, one of the things Scott said is we should draw lessons. We should draw lessons from these talks. And here's the lesson to all the other movements that are represented in the room tonight and all the other movements you're going to start. Never, ever take your eye off your origin story. Never, ever stop telling the world about the values that your movement embodies. And as a closing commercial, please buy my book.
Thank you, George.